Okay, in the following video, we are going to understand how to use methods, but now we are going to make a little bit of a modification. In methods, you can always create methods with or without parameters, plus with or without return values. Um, in our previous exercise, we did a program where we just created methods without parameters and they were all void methods. In this case, we are going to create not only methods, but add some parameters and of course, some return methods. So let me go back and I'm going to just copy and paste the problem that we are going to do. Remember to create a project. This project can be called primes or find primes, whatever you want. And inside the project, create a new class called primes2. Okay, I have two which I'm going to use as a reference, but you guys can use the one that says primes2. So you create a new primes2 class, and in this primes2 class, I'm going to copy and paste the problem that we have. Now, this program has to create an algorithm that asks a user to input a number from 1 to 100. Then the program will determine if this number is actually a prime or not. First thing you guys got to determine is the steps that you need in order to verify or identify the methods that we're going to use. So number one is ask the user for all the information, which in this case, the information is just a number from 1 to 100. So that's the first thing you got to do. Then my next step will be with that number, determine, so with the number, determine if it is prime or not. Okay, that would be the second step. So that would be another method called, we call it find prime or whatever. Okay. And finally is show if it is true or false. Okay, so these are the three steps, kind of like the three methods that we need in order to complete this code. Okay, so this is all the main method. I'm gonna just grab all this, and I'm gonna just since it's a comment, I am going to put it up here. I can make this all comments, and comments doesn't matter where I put them. And remember, every time that I'm gonna start a new class, I'm gonna import the java.util just so I can use the scanner object in a little while. This is mandatory in order to use input from the keyboard or from the user. Okay, so I'm gonna leave my public static void main alone. I'm gonna leave it like the stub method for now, and I'm gonna start creating my other methods. Now, this program different from the other ones that we're not going to have global variables. We're not going to use variables that are going to be across the whole program. In this case, we are going to pass those variables, or we're going to pass the parameters through the different methods definitions. And this is a good practice because sometimes you don't want global variables to be accessed by other methods that can be overwritten at any point of the program. Sometimes you just need the scope of the variable to be inside the method and can only be accessed within the method. That is a very important situation where we don't want to create global variables. Okay, so we have the public static void main, and we're going to start creating our methods. So our first method says ask the user for all the information. So I'm going to create a static, and this method is going to return something. Okay, now when I want a method to return a certain value, I need to type what type of variable I am going to return. In this case, it's a number. So after it asks the user for the input, it's going to return a number, which is the input of the user. So I'm going to, this method is going to return an integer, and I'm going to call it ask or user info. Let's call it user info. And in this case, user info will give me we'll ask the information to the user, but then when it finishes, it will return an integer number. Now, there is an error right here, and this error is because I haven't used the return function or the return call to return an integer. It says the method must return of type int, okay? And we're gonna do that in just a minute. Okay, so inside this method, I need to create my object, my scanner object. So scanner reader equals new scanner system.in, which I'm going to use to read the values from the input. And then I will start asking my user for some information and enter the number between 1 and 100. And then after I ask the user for that information, I will store that information using the reader object. I'm going to store it in an integer number called int num equals reader dot next int. And this is how I read from the input, I read from the keyboard, and I store it in a variable called number. Okay, now since this method returns an integer number, it is mandatory to use the return function. So I have to use return, and the completion of this method has to return an integer, and that integer is going to be num. So when it finishes, when I call user info, it's going to return a num, and I need to store it wherever I call it from. Okay, so this is the number. The end of this method will return an integer number. Okay, and that number, after I have that number, I will do something with that number, and it's all the calculations that we talked about in our second step. With the number, determine if it is prime or not. Okay, and to determine if a number is prime or not, I need to verify if it's divisible by every number below the number. Okay, so I'm going to create a new method, and this one is going to be called public static. And what I want from this method to return at the end is to tell me if it's prime or not. This is just a true or false statement. At the end of this method, it must return true or false. So in this case, my return value, or my the type of variable, is going to be a Boolean, and it's going to return a Boolean, and I'm going to call it prime or not. And in this case, inside the parentheses, in order for this method to work, I need a variable. So I need a number. Okay, since we're not using global variables anymore, I need to pass on the number. So in order for this method to find if it's prime or not, inside these parentheses, it needs a variable. And I can create any variable I want. Remember that the scope of the variable is only going to be inside the method. So I need an integer number, and I'm going to call it number, the one chosen by the user. And this is something that you really need to understand, because in the scope of variables, it is different, the variable from the definition and the other one. Okay, and the scope of the number will be the scope of this variable. It's going to be very important, because this number will only be accessed within the public static Boolean prime or not, within this method. Okay, so when we create this method, there are two things that are important. First of all, there is an error because I haven't returned a Boolean variable. If I don't return a Boolean variable like I did in the previous method, then I will have an error. Another thing is that I haven't used the int number inside the method. Okay, so let's begin. How do I need to use this? First of all, when it enters and it needs to find the number, it needs to create a for loop. And this for loop is going to tell me the number, if it's prime or not, because I need to obtain the number that I chose and then start dividing it by 1, by 2, by 3, by 4, until the number, and find out if there are more than 1 or 2 divisible numbers, and that will determine if it's prime or not. Okay, just as a review, remember that a prime number is only divisible by 1 and by itself. So if I were to count, I would have only 2 divisible numbers. If I have more than 2 divisible numbers, then the number is not prime. And based on that premise, we are going to create our program. So first of all, I'm going to create a count variable, and I'm going to initialize it in 0, just because I need this to be in 0, and start counting the number of divisible numbers. So for int I equals 0, so I'm going to start at 0. Sorry, I'm going to start at 1 because I don't want to divide by 0, so I'm going to start at 1, and then I'm going to make this go all the way less or equal than the number that I am choosing. Okay, so this is like this the iterations. It's going to start at 1 and it's going to finish at I less or equal than the number that I chose, and I'm going to increment by 1 my for loop. Okay, now in this for loop I need to ask every time if the number is divisible by I, because I is the one that's going to increment. So number divisible by 1, yes. Number divisible by 2, whatever. Okay, and start counting whenever this is true. So I'm going to create an if statement, and I'm going to say if number divisible by I is equal to 0, and um, this is just the way that I determine if the number is divisible by I and there's no remainder. This is what it's saying. If number is divisible by I and that operation does not give you a remainder, then it should count. Okay, so when this happens, I'm going to make it count every time, and I'm going to start counting every time that this is true. And at the end, when this finishes, I'm going to have the total number of counts, or the number of divisibles, numbers divisibles by the number. Okay, so after it finishes the loop, so after it finishes all this process, which is just having the number divided by 1, by 2, by 3, all the way to the number, and counting the number of divisibles, I need to ask again. So I need to make another condition and say if count is greater than 2. If the count is greater than 2, then it is not a prime number, okay? So in this case, I'm going to return a false because it's not a prime number. And otherwise, in case that the count is not greater than 2 or 2 or less, then in this case, I am going to return a true. And this is a way that I can do this. So in this case, I have my Boolean and I'm returning false or returning true, okay? You have to make sure that in every situation of your algorithm, there is something to return. Otherwise, it will not delete the error that was showing in the first place. Okay. So here's our very small algorithm that determines if it's prime or not. Okay. After I'm done with this part, I'm going to go to part 3, show if it is true or false. And in this case, I am going to do my third step, and this is just one that is going to show a string with all the information. So it's going to return a string, and I'm going to call it show result. Show result. And in this case, the object or the variable that I need in order to show result is just the Boolean that I got from the previous method. So in this case, I have a Boolean, and the Boolean is going to be called result. Okay. So in this case, looking at my method definition, I have a string that needs to be returned, something that like really fancy string saying the following number is prime because this and this. And in order for this method to work, I just need the result or a Boolean variable that I'm going to use. Okay. And here I'm just going to return the string, and the string is going to be the number you have chosen is. And remember, since we have true or false, or yes and no, or high and low, or 1 and 0, I can say the number you have chosen is, and then I'm going to add the result, which is true or false, and then say as a prime. So the number you have chosen is true as a prime, or it's false as a prime number. Okay. So this is kind of like the way that I want to show or display the result of my variable. Okay. Now, if I click or if I run this program, I'm going to minimize all the methods. I can minimize them just so it looks really nice and organized. Now, if I run this program, I will get absolutely nothing. Okay? And this is because even though I created every single method, I haven't called the methods in the order that I want. Remember that Java will run the main method, and since there's nothing in the main method, then it's not going to run anything. All these helper methods will need to be called. So let's start calling our user info. As you can see, user info returns an int and it doesn't have any parameters. So I'm going to use it the same way. And since it returns an int, I have to store it somewhere. So I am going to store it in a number, and then I'm going to say that, and I'm going to call user info just as it is. And this is how you call the method user info. This is the method definition. Okay. Now my second step will be called or verify prime or not. Again, this method returns a boolean, so I need to store it in a boolean. I'm going to call it boolean result, or yeah, answer, so we can, so you guys can differentiate from one another in another result. And like, remember that the scope of these variables is different from the scope within the methods, and they have nothing to do with each other. So I would be able to call this result and don't have a duplicate because of result inside the method. Okay, so, but I'm going to call it a different number just so you guys can know they're different. And I'm going to call prime or not. Now, in order to call prime or not, I need a number inside the parentheses. So the number that I need for this to work is the number that I got from the user info. So I'm going to use number, and I'm calling prime or not, and I'm using a number, and I'm sending this number to the method. Okay. And then finally, I'm going to show results, and the show results method requires a string, or it returns a string. So I need to store it in a string. And show result, I'm going to call it show result, and I am going to call them as the method show result. Let's change this variable just for show, so you guys can know that it's different. Show result, and inside show result is asking for a boolean variable, and this boolean variable is the one that I just obtained from the previous process, and it's stored in answer. So as you can see, using methods, passing on the parameters, it's really, really important. Now, the good thing about this is that I don't have any global variables. I don't use any global variables. I'm just passing on different parameters. And this is a very nice practice in programming. I think that we are good, and we just have to print show, because this is a string, the final string that I created from this operation. And I create show, and let's see if this runs. Click on OK, enter the number between and 100, and I'm going to use the number 47, which is a prime number, and the number you have chosen is true as a prime number, and that is correct. Now I can see some things that I can change, and just leave a space right here, and let's see with a number that is not prime, maybe the 50, and it says the number you have chosen is false as a prime number. So this is a very nice way to create programs. As you can see, look the amount of code that has been reduced and organized in a very easy to read way. Okay, so good luck with that. Practice with your methods, and of course, the more you practice, the better you will get at solving these type of problems.